As a philosopher, you are also well known for your British sense of humor, if I can say that to a Frenchman, and for your humility. It's thus with great pleasure and a bit of curiosity that we wish to hear you discuss the question atheism cannot answer, and tomorrow be as a comment at the same hour. You are all welcome. Thank you.
Well, let me then renew my most heartfelt gratitude to all the people who made this possible, to the people who invited me here at McGill. And well, I have to beg your pardon if I feel some stage pride after the list of those big fish who had this chair before me. And some of them are known to me, some are among my friends. Anyway, I try to do my best. And first, let me blurt out my thesis. The thesis in favor of which I should like to argue is the following one: atheism has failed. Hence, it is doomed to disappear in the long run. Our task consists in bringing this fact to consciousness and in drawing the consequences that it brings about. When so doing, I often get the impression, to my own eyes, of belaboring the obvious. But now the problem is that the majority of our contemporaries don't accept to face it, and we live among various attempts at camouflaging it. Well, now you must ask, well, is he really serious? Well, against my thesis, we are tempted to utter a powerful videtur quod non. This is Latin for bullshit. Would it not be more accurate to speak of a triumphal march of atheism? This is the way in which many atheists see the situation. Polls show that the number of church attendance is plummeting, at least in Europe, i.e. in countries that bear the stamp of Christianity. This is too obvious for me to waste time repeating it. To be sure, religions know today an unexpected comeback, especially in the most radical forms. For instance, in the most spectacular, because violent way in Islam, but in Hinduism as well. This happens also in more peaceful guise in groups such as the Haredim in Judaism or in Christianity among the so-called evangelical Christians. Well, the answer of atheists is ready. All this are rearguard battles. The progress of science and of technology that is narrowly linked up with it brings about irresistibly a secularization of life. We only have to be patient. Europe is the avant-garde. The rest of the world will follow suit. What lends this hope some grade of plausibility is the fact that, on the level of society, atheism carries the day. In his Thoughts on the French Affairs, that he wrote as soon as December 1791, Edmund Burke made the point that atheists have given up their traditional bashfulness and shifted to a more outspoken and even more provocative attitude. Quote, boldness formerly was not the character of atheists as such, but of late they are grown active, designing, turbulent, and seditious. Unquote. Nowadays, after 2 centuries, he would express himself more forcefully. Among the leading minds of late modernity, there were many atheists who advertised for their unbelief and attacked religion. The names of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche are in all memories. Today, we have to do with people whose intellectual quality is not a match against the 3 giants whom I have just mentioned, but they are noisier and receive the mass media a larger echo. Furthermore, spectacular successes are very much to the credit of atheism. Let me mention 2 big examples, one from the theoretical and one from the practical realm. First, on the theoretical level, modern physical science, written in mathematical language, to quote Galilei, succeeded in putting forward a description of reality that has no need of the God hypothesis, to allude to the well-known dialogue between the astronomer Laplace and Apollo. The personal piety of many scientists doesn't play any role in this matter. When they do physics, they work without reference to God as a stopgap. You recognize Dietrich Bonhoeffer's well-known phrase. By this token, one need not religion, or no more religion, when one looks for an explanation of the world. Let me here add a qualification. It is already dubious to understand religion in general as an explanation of physical phenomena. As such, there is little doubt that a scientific worldview is far more efficient, but one is allowed to ask whether any religion ever intended to do that. Some scientists and journalists who toy with the smattering of science short-sightedly imagine religion to have been some sort of physics still in infancy. Yet, the study of the worldview of the so-called primitive peoples shows that they hardly care for the structure of the world, let alone for its causes or for the way it came into existence. And in later religions, one could quote utterances of the Buddha, who discarded every question of cosmology as useless, or even, for that matter, the Talmud. The second success. On the practical level, modern political thought and practice succeeded in showing that societies can organize themselves without a suprahuman principle of legitimacy. As soon as 1682, the French philosopher Pierre Bayle defended his famous paradox, according to which atheism is not more dangerous for the state than superstition, and even that a society of atheists would be more docile than one of religious enthusiasts. Our societies made of this intuition or wager a concrete reality, each in its own style, from the American wall of separation to the French laïcité, and so on and so forth. On this point, too, I would like to qualify things. Not all religions want to foist on society a model of order. In particular, Christianity distinguishes itself from the former religions insofar as it doesn't impose on people other rules of conduct as the ones that natural, unaided reason either discovered or could have discovered. Be that as it may, on balance, we may conclude that in order to orient ourselves in the material world and in social organization, we need no religion. Therefore, some sort of atheism is possible. Let me now make 2 observations on this kind of atheism. First, such an atheism is not necessarily militant, necessarily belligerent, as an aggressive conviction. It exists, first and foremost, as a methodological principle that the divine must be put into brackets. The word agnosticism was coined exactly for this purpose by the English natural scientist and indefatigable advocate of Darwin's doctrine of evolution, Thomas Huxley. In Victorian England, atheism was hardly a thing. Therefore, in the course of a discussion held in 1869 at a metaphysical society, Huxley suggested that his own position should be named agnosticism. Second point, agnosticism doesn't represent a position that concerns religious questions only, such as God's existence. An analogous stance of modesty and soberness is to be found when what is at stake is our knowledge of physical phenomena. The positivism of Auguste Comte and of Claude Bernard makes of the renunciation to an insight into the ultimate causes a basic principle. Scientific inquiry should content itself with expressing the relations that obtain between the phenomena in the most precise way with the help of mathematical language. Why what is what it is. Why it is how it is, science is not allowed to ask. In the teeth of all its successes, atheism, even in its mildest form, Gnosticism, as being alluded to, atheism contains a lethal drawback, a sickness unto death. For there is a question on which atheism hasn't anything to say. But is more, it grounds itself in the decision to give up any possibility of answering this question. This fundamental question is the following one. If we admit that there is on this earth a being known as Homo sapiens, a being that is able to give an account of the universe that surrounds him, and to live peacefully with his fellow men without having to look up towards any transcendent reality, that would it be good that such a being should be and keep existing? To put it otherwise, we can sketch a merely immanent description of physical reality that enables human beings to conquer the world and to exploit it for their own advantage. We need not uncover the ultimate truth about reality as long as the description we make of it works. We can set rules for the living together of the human beings in a merely immanent way. It is enough for us to conceive of a compact through which human beings lay on themselves the duty to spare each other because it is in their interest to do so. The German philosopher Kant even said that a political problem is solvable even in a society of devils, provided they are intelligent. The ultimate goal of the mastery of nature through technology and of the social organization through politics is that mankind should go on existing and even improve its lot. Now, the question whether such an existence and or progress is something we should wish and foster, this question remains unanswered and even not asked. For this reason, atheism has no answer and can't have any. In order to substantiate this claim, I must here venture some words of the self-defeating character of atheism. I say self-defeating because the failure of theism is a direct consequence of its success, i.e. of what I've just been sketching. By this token, we may be allowed to speak of a dialectics of the theism in the same meaning as in the well-known dialectics of enlightenment of Adorno and Horkheimer. Yet, whereas the two masters of the School of Frankfurt remained on the level of ideas, we have to do here with a dialectics that could take utterly concrete features. Let me give here a brief outline of this dialectic. The project of modern atheism consisted in bringing about an emancipation of man. Man was to decide on his own destiny. He had to give his own law to himself, which we somehow loosely call autonomy. In former times, this was not the case. This was not even possible if we have to trust the way in which the modern project tells its own story. Man had to set his or her life according to principles that lie outside of him or her. The overarching principle was, in some cases, the beautiful order of the cosmos. This is a phrase that boils down to a tautology, because cosmos means precisely a beautiful order. The beautiful order of the cosmos that man had to imitate. It was in other cases, this overarching principle, was in other cases the divine law which man had to go by. I happen to have written a book on each of those two possibilities. But the 2 points of reference are intertwined. The God who emits the commands is at the same time the God who gave the world its order. The legislator is the same as the creator. Now, modern times refuse more and more decidedly to look in those 2 directions. Their ideal would be to let man rest on a human basis only, so that any reference to an outside, to an other, to an higher being would be excluded or even become meaningless. To put it as the young Karl Marx, the root of man is man himself. He says that, trying to define in a mild etymological pun the adjective radical. Radicalism means that we have to look for the root, and the root is man's himself. The 19th century has minted for this ideal a name that is to be read in the young Karl Marx too, humanism. The word has several meanings. As a category for historians, it designates the movement of rediscovery and reappropriation of the heritage of classical literatures that began in 14th century Italy. Concretely, the leaders of this movement, say Petrarca, were no enemies of religion, but on the contrary, pious persons. Yet, it is interesting to observe that the making of the word as a category of historiography took place at the same time as the use of the same word to express some sort of declaration of independence of man towards God, i.e. in the early 40s of the 19th century. Humanism, as an epoch and as the renewal of interest in classical antiquity, was introduced into academic parlance probably by the German historians Karl Heinrich Wilhelm Hagen. And humanism, as the exclusive attention given to human beings, is to be read in the left-wing Hegelian Arnold Ruge, then in Feuerbach, Proudhon, and so on. Now, this humanism, precisely because it does not admit any higher instance than man, is unable to pass judgment on the value, or lack of it, of man as such. Man can't possibly speak either in favor of him or herself or against him or herself. course, it is very much likely that man would take a positive view of the existence of man, but such an acquittal would be utterly worthless. In a lecture he gave right after the last World War, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre brought this out by poking fun at an utterance of the poet, another Frenchman, Jean Cocteau, the French multifaceted painter and writer, was seated in an aircraft that flew above some mountainous chain. He admired the landscape and still more the inventive mind of man, so that he exclaimed, "Man is terrific." This may be true, but Sartre asks, who is speaking? Certainly neither a dog nor a horse, hence not an unbiased umpire, but a man. And it is clear that nobody can judge on him or herself objectively. The question I asked above, i.e., is this good that there should be men? This question might be whisked away as merely academic. This would be the case if two new elements had not been on the stage for some decades now. First, man is at present in possession of the possibility of doing away with himself. The question about suicide exists since the earliest times. It received a theoretical treatment in Stoic philosophy. What is new is that the problem has taken a collective dimension. The human species is now able to commit an all-encompassing suicide. It possesses the means that could bring this about. Let me mention here three of these means. First, since the beginning of industrialization, man has been spoiling the environment. This could lead to a situation in which the existence of man would become utterly impossible. Second, since the discovery of atom energy and of its possible military use, man possesses the faculty to wipe himself out in a moment through an all-out nuclear war. 3. With new means of chemical contraception, each generation can freely decide whether there will be a next generation or none at all. This third possibility would be peaceful, piecemeal, hence hardly visible. In contradistinction to the second example, atomic warfare, but exactly as in the first, i.e. about pollution of the environment, this end of mankind would not be foisted on it from above, for instance, by the state that would launch into atomic warfare. It would be the result of a daily plebiscite in which each individual would be free to choose. In a long footnote to his Confession of the Curate of Savoy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau takes up the comparison that already had become hackneyed between fanaticism and atheism. He rounds it up with a pithy formula, quote, its principles, and he means the principles of atheism, don't cause the death of people, but they prevent them from being born. We may observe that atheistic regimes of the 20th century produced mass murders on a far larger scale than religious wars did. But Rousseau was fortunate not to know. But let us admit, for the sake of argument, that is being true. Rousseau goes on. To be sure, fanaticism lets blood flow, but it prompts people to great enterprises. That's a rather strange idea. On the other hand, atheism even if it does not kill anybody, reveals itself as being more lethal in the long run. So much for the first of the two newly occurred elements that change the terms of the problem. With a second new element, we make a step further. Annihilation, extinction, that already had shifted from merely logical possibility to real possibility, becomes a temptation. Well, a logical possibility is what is not contradictory. A real possibility is that the causes of which are real, whether they are acted, whether they are on or off, is another question. But the causes are there. We have atomic weapons. We have industrial pollution. We have chemical, very refined contraception. We could do away with ourselves. Then the second element that brings about some sort of temptation simply to, well, call it a day with human adventure. Man calls in doubt his or her legitimacy. We are no longer sure that it is good there should be men. We can look at this once again from 3 points of view, and I'll be very brief. First, man is not convinced any longer that he or she has the right to conquer and exploit the earth. Second, man is not convinced any longer of his or her superiority over against the other living beings. 3, man is not even sure that he or she distinguishes him or herself from other living beings by radically different features. There is no quality leap, according to some biologists or zoologists, between men and, say, bonobo apes. As a matter of course, we very well could content ourselves to imagine that survival instinct will look after man and ensure the existence of the species. This may have been the case in former times. It is highly probable that man as a species will carry on existing because people will keep reproducing themselves. But Schopenhauer tried to show that sexual instinct is hardly more than a trap through which the will to live fools us without giving a darn about the happiness of individuals. Can we answer him? The trouble is, in any case, that the appeal to instinct would do away with the whole project of enlightenment. I don't mean thereby only the movement that became conscious of itself and gave itself this name in 18th century Europe. I mean the project of philosophy in the whole breadth of its achievements. I've been told that on the poster that announces my lecture, an unknown hand scribbled, instead of the question that atheism can't answer, the question that atheism need not bother to answer. This is exactly the kind of attitude that I am attacking here, i.e., not paying attention to the question and, putting one's trust in the irrational survival instincts, or alleged instincts of the human species. This would mean to give up the project of philosophy, a project which is as old as Socrates, and his endeavor to set to task every professional man to compel him to show his competence, which was to take place by his explaining why exactly he does what he does. professional people had to give an account. In Greek, logon didona. The enterprise went further and enlarged itself into a project of asking for the ground of each and every phenomenon. In metaphysics, Leibniz put it on the throne by formulating the principle of reason. On the level of European modern history, this held true mainly for the institutions. Every statutory order, every social system and organization had to stand in the dock, in front of the court of reason, and to show its credentials. The question being, to put it with Kant, whether it could stand the free and public examination of reason. Generally meaning, every action without exception should be, in principle, justified by reasons. Now, are we allowed to give up the quest for a ground when what is at stake is the very being of mankind? If we did that, we would have to face something unbearable. We would entrust the existence of the only being who can be the carrier of reason to unreason. We meet here a paradox that is already pointed out on another level. Natural science represents a fantastic triumph of reason. But at the same time, it claims to show that reason is merely a product, a byproduct, an unintentional byproduct, an epiphenomenon of evolution, that is, of a movement that was led by blind and irrational forces. But with a second paradox I've just been bringing out, we would be in a still worse predicament. If reason stems from unreason, we can hardly reproach her for that. It's not her fault. But in the case that I'm dealing with now, reason would sort of commit suicide and high treason against herself. Most concretely, we hear everywhere that the best way to hamper the so-called population explosion that some people still fear is education, and especially school for girls. This may be true, but what is in any case above any doubt is that such a method is morally far superior to compulsory measures like sterilization. And it is possible and even highly probable that it works better too. Well, we can deduce from this very nice observation a rather unpleasant consequence. The more intelligent, the more learned is a human group, the more barren it must be. Or conversely, the more stupid and ignorant, the more fruitful. Present-day European demography furnishes us with an almost experimental proof of this equation. It is probably not by chance that the decrease in birth rates affects Europe, and there the educated bourgeoisie, and in the rest of the world, the countries and the social classes that are supposed to be the most progressive. Now, mind you, I'm not claiming that the shrinking of religious faith in Europe or elsewhere could be the cause of the lower birth rates. Looking for causes is already, in itself, a dubious endeavor. Historians are always reluctant to do that. But, admitted one does, one has to take one's bearing from the fact that such causes most probably are a tangled skein of factors that influence each other, and so on and so forth. In order to see more clearly this maze, one could and should mobilize sociology, psychology, economy, all fields in which I have no competence. I would like here to draw upon a very old, very classic distinction, the one between cause and ground, or reason if you prefer. A fact has causes. An action has grounds. A cause explains what is the case already. A ground concerns what we can bring about in the future. If one could discover the causes of an action, this action wouldn't be free any longer. It wouldn't be an action any longer, by the way, but rather a mechanism. Finally, where does the lower birth rates among educated people come from, and where they lead, is for me a matter of indifference. But what we desperately need here is not an explanation, but a reason for us to act. We absolutely must be able to tell why the existence of men on this earth is a good thing. If the project of enlightenment is to be successful, man needs a ground for man to go on existing. And to do that as man in the full meaning of the term, i.e. as a rational and free being, and not only as a biped without feathers, to allude to the well-known quip of Diogenes against Plato. Man is in need of a point of reference that can legitimate his existence on the earth, which doesn't mean, mind out, that it legitimates each of man's whims, and certainly not the ruthless explanation of the planet. The existence of a superhuman instance that can affirm the existence of a human species is the first content of religion. This instance is, to quote Aquinas' famous formula, at the end of each of the 5 paths, the viae, that lead us to acknowledge God's existence, what we loosely call proofs of God's existence. He calls this quod omnes nominant Deum. This is what everybody calls by the name of God. Now, to be quite concrete and matter-of-fact, we need a category of human beings who can bring together in harmony faith and reason. Faith, because they must have an Archimedean point, an external, transcendent reference point from which the existence of the human species can become legitimate. And we need people who can bring reason together in order that the species that would be made possible by this way would be really human and not simply, featherless bipeds, like I told you. We need such a category, such a human type, not in order to make human life more beautiful, not as an oil of sorts that could make social life easier, could make the social machine hum better. Those are, by the way, 2 arguments that were often put forward by apologetics. We need religion in order to have a good society. We need religion to have some aesthetic sense, to encounter the beautiful, things like that. I am therefore more radical. We need that in order to ensure the continuation of the human adventure. As a catchword, and to be sure not without a touch of irony, I would suggest we need a new Middle Ages. We should bid farewell to the modern attempt to weigh anchors away from the Middle Ages. I mean, we need real Middle Ages, and in no case the caricature that modern times had to draw in order to justify themselves. We need a Middle Ages that take up the achievements of modern times in a positive way and integrates them in a new synthesis. Medieval studies become a wholly actual field. For the problems with which the Middle Ages had to struggle are still ours. I'm not pleading in favor of a getting back to. No getting back to is worthwhile. But rather, I would plead in this case to quote a well-known phrase, a hermeneutic of continuity. The question isn't any longer whether we can do without God, but rather with what kind of God we shall have to live if we want mankind to live on. The God of the Bible and of the Christians is not the only possible one. There are besides him the God of their religions, the God or gods of neo-pagan or para-pagan movements, and into the bargain the God whom Pascal called the God of the philosophers and other scientists. But my hunch is that the God of the Bible and of the Christians could be a very good candidate. Well, this is another story. Thank you for your attention.